A lot of people asked me when I first moved to Hungary what my biggest culture shock was. And to be honest, I didn't have very much culture shock in the traditional sense. A lot of the things here are just not that different from home. But of course, one of the things that you have to do when you move to a new place is learn what are the norms of communication there, particularly what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And this was actually one of my biggest culture shocks. See, I come from a state that a lot of people would call politically correct. We are quite conscious of the words that we use. In the culture that I come from, if you use slurs or just words that are in general derogatory towards a certain group of people, you will get called out most often. And if a group expresses that a term that has been used for them in the past is offensive and they would like it to stop, it doesn't take that long for that to catch on where I'm from, and people just adjust and move on with their life. One of these words is the term gypsy, which we do not use where I am from. We use the term Roma or Romani. So of course that word is common here, and that is the word that is used in English to describe Romani people. And that was something I knew, but I didn't realize how often I would hear it. And I had to think about before I moved, like, I'm gonna be around people who have very different standards of vocabulary, and what will I point out and maybe push back on, and what won't I? And given that the Romani population here has their own words in Hungarian to describe themselves, it's not my knowledge of how that translates best, so it's not something that I try to argue with anybody. There are certain things, I'll still call out misogynistic stuff, and I will still call out people for the N-word. I never actually heard a white person say the N-word in person until I moved to Hungary. My process of learning the rules of communication here wasn't just me learning what I shouldn't say because it's impolite, but learning that things that I've always known to be impolite or that you could not say back at my home are normal to say here. So that was by far my biggest culture shock when moving here.
The Stranger by Alfred Schuetz talks about the unspoken rules of communication that a person who moves to a new place has to learn in order to become an accepted part of the community there. And it also talks about how they can live on the margins when that integration isn't completed. And I feel like in my experience in Hungary, this is something that kind of fluctuates day by day. Because I, being an immigrant of European ancestry, blend in. So when I am in public, I am often perceived as a Hungarian. I know this from the amount of people who just tell me that they think thought I was Hungarian, and the amount of people who just automatically speak to me in Hungarian in public, completely expecting me to understand. And it's weird because there'll be times when I'll have been on my own in public for a while and I know that I'm being perceived as Hungarian, and then I meet up with somebody who I speak English with, and suddenly, there's people looking at us. I've been sitting at cafes or something talking, and I can hear the Hungarians at the table next to us looking at us say, Amerikai. And I know that they're talking about me, but I still don't know enough to know what they're saying. It feels almost like my cover's been blown, like the gig is up. In those cases, it reminds me that, like, I am an outsider here. I am an immigrant. And I still have a long ways to go before I am able to understand the unspoken rules, especially when I'm not even fluent in the language yet. And so it was interesting to me thinking about that essay and thinking about the significance of being perceived. My boyfriend is Hungarian, and he told me about this study that he read where they had surveyed a bunch of Hungarians and they asked them what they think it is that makes a person Hungarian. And by far the most common answer was that they speak Hungarian. And the thing that the study found that Hungarians base their sense of community off of is the shared language. So somebody who grew up outside of Hungary, if they speak Hungarian, they are Hungarian. Somebody who's lived in Hungary for a long time but doesn't speak Hungarian, not Hungarian. But if you speak the language, you are considered a part of the group. Whereas in the US, there's lots of people who speak English, but wouldn't necessarily be considered part of the in-group because everybody speaks English. But Hungary is such a small language. It's mostly spoken inside the country with just a few million Hungarian speakers outside of the country. So it has a lot to do with Hungarian identity. And of course, I'm never going to be Hungarian. I'm always going to be American. I'm always going to be Irish, Danish, and German. But for as long as I'm in Hungary, I do want to be able to be an active member of the community. And so for me, a big part of that is going to be actually learning Hungarian. I'd love to be able to always use Hungarian when I'm at a store or a restaurant, but I can't yet. And it's a reminder that as soon as I open my mouth in Hungary, I become perceived as the foreigner, as the stranger. So that part of the essay was interesting to me. That one kind of stuck with me and reflected some of my experience so far. So I learned something today. I was at a cafe with my boyfriend here in Oregon, and I mentioned to him how I can always tell that we're back in the US when I see everybody wearing beanies. And we were in this cafe, and all around there was customers, there was kids, there was even people working at the cafe wearing beanies. And my boyfriend said, yeah, it's actually kind of weird for me because in Hungary it's rude to wear hats inside. I did not know this. I did not know this yet, that it's rude to wear hats inside in Hungary. I've gone to class with a beanie on so many times. So I learned today that I have been unintentionally impolite to my professors many times. I would see people wearing hats in Hungary, but now that I think about it, I really only saw it outside. I didn't really see it indoors. But I didn't question that. It wasn't something that I noticed. I hadn't thought that like, oh, it might be rude to wear this indoors because it was just so normal for me. I guess I'm gonna have to stop wearing my beanies to class. It's just another one of the little details of the expectations for social engagement that I didn't assume because it's not normal in my country, and I didn't see it mentioned anywhere when I was trying to look up what's polite and impolite. So I didn't know. And now a year and a half after moving to Hungary, now I know. One thing that I didn't expect when moving to Hungary was the constant low-level mental exhaustion from having to convert every measurement that I see. The US measurement system, we use the imperial, Hungary uses metric, but there are way more different measurements or different units that are not the same for us, and it's constant. Pretty much any time I leave my house, I'm having to convert numbers in my head for the distance to get somewhere. I do that in miles. Here's kilometers. It's also when I go to the store, all my recipes use cups and tablespoons, and everything is in grams and kilograms, and so I have to try to remember how much that is when I need to convert for cups, but then also I have to buy it in forints, but all my money is in USD, and so I have to remember how many forints is $1, and then if that's the case, then how many dollars is it per serving of this item, but this item is in grams, and I put my serving in cups, and it's a lot more work just to go get my groceries. We measure weight differently. It's not pounds, it's kilograms, and when I go to the bar with friends, I was so confused at first because I would see 3 deciliters or 5 deciliters up on there, and I was just like, which one is closer to 12 ounces? Like, a lot of times the time in Hungary is written in the 24-hour clock, so my classes are all noted in the 24-hour clock. Stores are listed in the 24-hour clock, and so that was one of the first things that I changed when I moved to Hungary is I put my phone on the 24-hour clock and my computer on the 24-hour clock so that I would get used to that sooner, and it still throws me off because we just use AM and PM. I'd never used the 24-hour clock in my life before. Not only that, but then it's dates. Anytime I have to write down a date, I get so stressed because in the US, we write the month, the date, and the year. And in most of the world, they write the day, the month, and the year. And I always have to double and triple check that I actually wrote it in the correct order so I don't mess up a form. It's even anytime I go somewhere new and I need to go to the third floor or the second floor. And so if something's on the third floor in Hungary, it's on the fourth floor in the US. It's constant. And it's tiring. And it's not extreme. It's not a huge deal. But there are some days when I don't go an hour without having to stop and do a conversion of some units in my head. It's a type of kind of mental drain that I was not anticipating. So yesterday I took my boyfriend to do a traditional American Christmas activity, which is to go look at Christmas lights. And in my town, there's this one neighborhood, which is pretty much where all the rich people live, which everybody goes to see the Christmas lights because they decorate all over. They go all out. You'll see cars just lining the streets. A bunch of people go, and like we walked around, and some of these houses go insane. We have this one house where they have set up the lights to go in specific patterns to music. It's just very entertaining. So they rent out a radio station and you turn on the radio to that, and then you can watch the lights perform to the song. What was interesting for me was we got back and I was asking him what he thought of it. And for him, it felt a little excessive. He got the impression that the people were just trying to kind of show off their wealth. And I was like, yeah, duh. Of course it's a competition between the neighbors to have the best house. We're all aware of this. But like, it's entertaining for us. And for him, it left, like, he enjoyed it and it was interesting, but it wasn't charming like it is for me. He didn't have that childhood connection to it. And that was just really interesting to see, where I was trying to explain to him why we value it and why it is fun here. How it's something you do from your child and the whole community does it. And it's fun to see what changes every year because you go to the same places. But from the cultural context that he was coming from, it felt wasteful and it felt prideful. And that was just not something that he was able to disconnect from the experience of going and seeing the Christmas lights. I know that America's culture is often stereotyped as excessive and as prideful, but this is always such a charming thing for me. So to have that difference pointed out in something that's such a part of my childhood and my Christmas experience every year was just really interesting. Something else I need to talk about. My boyfriend had an experience the other day when he got to learn that something he was saying was not how he meant it, which has happened to me in Hungary multiple times. So it was very fun to see the reverse. He was helping me with my Hungarian, and we were working on the sound, which I apparently can say pretty much fine when I say like köszönöm, but when I try to say zöld, like green, it warps. I could never get it just right. And I couldn't figure out how to make the sound correctly in my mouth. But I was trying, and I was asking him, I was like, okay, how is it now? And he'd go, pretty good. And I was get so dejected. And I was trying and adjusting things. And okay, how is it now? And he'd say, oh, it's pretty good. And I was like, damn it. And then I realized something. And I asked him, I was like, okay, when you say pretty good, is that better than good or worse than good? Like, if good is 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, is pretty good a 4 or is it a 6? And he was like, it's better than good. It'd be like a 6. And that is not how it is here in the US. Something that is pretty good is almost good. It's not entirely good. It's like 80 to 90% good. And I had to explain this to him. When you're telling me that this is pretty good, it's sounding to me like it's not actually good. It's just kind of there. I explained that to my boyfriend, and yeah, now he knows that if he says something is pretty good, it's going to be taken as adequate, or okay, or fine, but not as good, and definitely not as better than good. So it was kind of funny for me to get to see the reverse of the situations that I have been in. See somebody else realize that they've been using something incorrectly, because that's a pretty common part of my experience as a foreigner living in a new country. So for him to come to the US, and of course this could have happened in Hungary, but for him to have that experience in the reverse, kind of helps me feel better about my experience as the foreigner all the time when I get to help somebody else realize a cultural code or unspecified communicative norm is something that they're messing up, because typically for me, I'm the one doing it. So my boyfriend experienced another cultural difference regarding measurement today. We went to Crater Lake, which is this national park in Oregon, where there's just this lake in the crater of a giant ancient volcano. And my boyfriend had read on the internet before that Americans measure distances in football fields and school buses. And I was like, that's silly, but we don't really do that. And I was proven wrong. We were at the national park, and we were in this spot with a ranger. We were looking out over the lake, and there's a smaller, it's not really an island, it's this outcropping from when the explosion happened, called Phantom Ship. And the lady was telling us about Phantom Ship and how it formed, and then said that it is about 2 football fields long. And my boyfriend whipped around to look at me to smile because he was proved right. Not only do we use football fields as measurements in the US, but a government worker used football fields as a measurement. Which, of course, I explained to him that American football is just so everyday. The majority of people at some point have been on an American football field. And so it's a practical size that we can associate with something. It's also very simple. They're 100 yards long. So we know the measurement too. You could say it's 200 yards. But when you say 2 football fields, that connects it to something that we have an actual real life association with, not just a random unit. So I think it's more fun that way, personally. But yeah, I was proven wrong. We do actually measure in football fields. So talking about measuring things in football stadiums reminded me of a little dilemma that I face every once in a while while I'm in Hungary. And that is a dilemma of what to call football / soccer / not American football. So in America, what we call soccer is what the rest of the world calls football. And what we call football, the rest of the world calls American football, because we're the only ones who call it that. So whenever I'm talking to my classmates and I want to bring up football for some reason, the global football, I never know what exactly to call it, because I want to use the terms that they use as people from all around the world. I want to just call it football, not soccer. But they know that I'm American, and they know that we call it soccer, and they know that what we call football is American football. And so if I use the term football to talk about what I would normally call soccer, I don't know if they're going to automatically assume that I'm talking about American football because I'm American, or if they're going to understand that I'm talking about like the global version of football. And so sometimes I specify and I'm like, football, like soccer football. And when I do talk about American football, I always call it American football. But yeah, I never know if they're going to assume that I'm using the same term they use, or if they're in their head going to translate it to the American versions of those words. Especially given the stereotypes about Americans being dumb and Americans being like culturally ignorant. Like I wouldn't be surprised if people would assume that I would just continue using the American words for those. So it doesn't happen often, but it's always a little dilemma for me about how do I communicate this clearly. I know what words I should use, but I don't know what assumptions they're going to make about me because of their knowledge of my culture. And that's just an extra layer of difficulty to communication that I was not anticipating when I moved out of my country.
So I'm at my sister's house today for my niece's 6th birthday party, and my niece is having a bunch of her classmates over to celebrate. Her class is quite multi-ethnic. They live in a pretty diverse city. And as we were talking about her classmates that are coming, it made me think of something that I realized about 6 months after I moved to Hungary. See, the US is often called a country of immigrants. The majority of us here are not originally from here. I had friends whose parents or grandparents came from all different continents and countries, and they would still practice lots of different parts of their home cultures. When I moved to Hungary, I started meeting classmates and roommates and people who were from these countries that my friends' parents or grandparents were from. And it made me realize how significant the divide is between practicing your traditional culture in a new country versus actually growing up in that country. So, what I was exposed to growing up was integrated cultures, or sometimes Americanized cultures, or just immigrant cultures where you are practicing parts of it, speaking your ancestral language, eating traditional foods, celebrating special holidays. But day in and day out, my daily experience was a lot more similar to my other American friends' daily experiences than their experiences are from people from the same original country who actually grew up in that country. And I knew that, of course, but I didn't realize how big of a difference it was. And this divide is something that I've had to think about in regards to my own future children. It's quite possible that I'm not going to raise my kids in the US. So I've had to think about what parts of my culture will I want to keep and introduce my children to when they're not growing up in that context. What traditions and celebrations, codes and phrases and things will I want to make sure that they experience and they know? See, as an immigrant myself, no matter how much I assimilate, I will still be American, and I will still have that part of my culture, and that will still inform a lot of my daily life and my experiences. And my kids would be growing up in a mixed one, where they would be growing up outside the US, but they'd be visiting the US and they'd have family in the US. And it's not easy being the stranger. It's not easy being the one having to learn other cultural codes. And it's also not easy having two homes, especially when they're so far away from each other. And if I have kids outside the US, then they'll have two homes from the moment they're born. And I don't want them to feel like a stranger in either of them. And I want them to feel like they're an outsider. But thankfully, I have a lot more years before I have to think more about that. But it's something that I didn't anticipate thinking about and realizing when I moved to Hungary. And one of the things that has been really fun to contemplate. So I'm currently packing to go back to Hungary. I fly out tomorrow, and it is interesting. For the summer, I came back to the US to work, and then my boyfriend flew out for the last 2 weeks of summer, and then we headed back, and I was not mentally prepared. Of course, there was things I was excited for about going back, but I was just not in the mental space. I had been back in my home, in my context, with my own community and my family and friends. And then we'd spent those last 2 weeks of me showing my boyfriend all over, basically getting the highlight reel of my home state. And then I had to say, okay, goodbye, leaving it. And it was actually a lot harder to go back for the second time than it was the first time. It affected my performance in school because I didn't have a good transition, and I was not in a good headspace. But one thing that I realized with moving is that one of my biggest regrets is not appreciating Oregon enough when I lived here. There's so many places in Oregon I still haven't gone. There's so many things I would have done more often if I had known how fast this portion of my life would come up, where I'm no longer living in Oregon. And I don't want to do that with Hungary. I'm going to live there a while longer, but I'm not going to live there my whole life. And I want to appreciate it while I have it. So I'm trying to get myself back in the right headspace so that when I'm back in that new context where I am the foreigner and I am the immigrant and I am the stranger, I can handle it well and I can appreciate it. Because when I first moved there back in the end of August of 2021, I was so excited. In preparation now, I've been looking through all my photos from the first month that I moved there and all the things that I did that were so fun and exciting. And I've been trying to get back into that headspace because, yeah, when you're
when you're going to somewhere so different from home and so far from home, it's hard. It's exciting and it's fun, but there's so many unexpected difficulties. A lot of the fun things are more challenging just because it's not the system that you grew up in, and it's been weird kind of seeing what friendships from home have held on and what ones have kind of fizzled off since I've been so far away. But I have some wonderful friends in Hungary, and I have some wonderful Hungarian friends, and I really want to foster those friendships. And that can be difficult sometimes with our cultural differences. But when it comes to the friendships, once you've actually gotten to know somebody, it takes sometimes a little explaining. You gotta be willing to ask questions, and you gotta be willing to answer questions. But I really enjoy, I really appreciate and value my community there. It reminded me actually of one of the sweetest things. My boyfriend's cousin got married this last summer, and I was in the US when they were getting married, so I couldn't go. But he told me that I was invited, and that's all I expected, was just that he would tell me, because he found out I was his plus one. But then he later told me that before they knew that I wouldn't be able to come, they planned on making one extra invitation that was all translated into English for me. And that just melted my heart. Just knowing that these people who had never met me, I hadn't met them yet, but they knew that I was American, and they knew that I didn't speak Hungarian, and they could have just sent me an identical invitation to everybody else's, but they were gonna go out of their way to make one in English for me, just to make it so I can have a personalized invitation, and so I can understand it. And that has been pretty typical, actually, of my experience in Hungary. Just people being very willing to be welcoming and to make an explicit points to be welcoming. That's been really, really meaningful to me. Whereas I'm, as a foreigner, very much try to take on my shoulders to bridge any gaps, and as a stranger to learn the norms of the place that I'm in. I mean, that's my job. I'm the outsider coming in. And so when people will reach back across that gap to me, and try to welcome me in just as I am, without this expectation of me completely conforming to this other context, it's really sweet, and it really makes you feel seen, and it really makes you feel welcome when you don't have to hide or change who you are to be welcomed in. Yeah.
I have arrived back in Hungary. I'm settled back into my flat, and I had just a few more thoughts that I wanted to share. Looking back over the last 60 days, my time split here in Hungary and my time back in the States, with also having my Hungarian boyfriend there, and just from spending this time thinking about the process of adjusting from being a stranger to assimilating into a group, and the process of learning the norms of a new place and the unspoken rules that exist there. It has made me really appreciative that I already knew some Hungarians before I came here. I have some Hungarian American friends whose dad is from my hometown and their mom is from Szeged. And through them I met a bunch of other Hungarians. And so from the first day that I moved here, I already had people who were a part of the local community that I could learn from and ask questions to. And then of course, in the end of November, the first year, I met my boyfriend, and with him I've been able to learn even more about Hungarian culture, and he's helped me learn so much about how to communicate well in Hungarian, as well as just what is polite or impolite, normal or not normal for just everyday life here. And in the reverse, I got to do that for him this December back home, where sometimes he would have moments where he was confused as to what was going on or what was the right way to behave or to act. And I could guide him and these things are often arbitrary. The essay The Stranger talks about how one of the challenges is that these rules don't make sense to the stranger because they're not rooted in any tangible, real rules. They're social rules. They've evolved. And things like when we left a store in the mall, he said goodbye to the worker who was standing by the store, and that's weird in my home, but here it would be normal to say goodbye to a worker as you leave. And there's no real right or wrong in that situation. It's just what each of the cultures have developed as a way to have their members interact with each other. So I'm just really grateful that not only did I meet Hungarians along my way here that have just welcomed me in, but that I had the benefit of already having that in when I moved here. And I think it made my adjustment so much easier, because whether it was that I needed something translated and Google was not helpful, or that I didn't know if something I was saying was polite or impolite in this context, I had a wealth of people that I could just text and ask. And having that interpersonal resource as the stranger, where you can get correction and get guidance without judgment, is so valuable. So yeah, at the end of this project, I'm just left with a lot of fun memories and quite thankful.